Emma Parker knew something was wrong the moment Daniel came home smiling too hard. He placed a glossy brochure on the kitchen counter of their home in Naperville, Illinois, and said, "Mom booked us a cruise." He tried to make it sound exciting, like a reward for his long hours at work and his recent promotion, but Emma felt a quiet pressure in her chest. The cruise would leave from Miami and sail through the Caribbean for 7 days. It sounded beautiful, almost perfect, yet one detail made her stomach tighten: Linda was coming with them. Linda Carter, her mother-in-law, was elegant, confident, and always certain she knew what was best for her son. From the beginning of Emma and Daniel's marriage, Linda had watched her closely, correcting small things, offering advice that felt more like judgment. Emma had spent 3 years trying to win her approval and 3 years feeling like she never quite did. Still, she smiled and said the cruise sounded wonderful because she loved Daniel and didn't want another quiet argument about his mother. A month later, they stood at the busy port in Miami, sunlight bouncing off the massive white ship in front of them. Linda wore oversized sunglasses and gave instructions as if she were leading a tour group. Daniel carried the luggage and checked his phone between conversations. Emma walked slightly behind them, telling herself this would be good for their marriage. The first evening on the ship was filled with music and laughter from strangers who seemed lighter than she felt. The ocean stretched endlessly around them as the ship pulled away from shore, and Emma stood alone by the railing, watching Miami shrink into the distance. The wind lifted her hair, and for a brief moment she felt free, like the sea might wash away the tension she had been carrying for months. Daniel had been called away by Linda to meet the captain at a private welcome event she had arranged, leaving Emma to explore on her own. She told herself it didn't matter. She was used to feeling slightly outside their world. As she leaned against the railing, someone beside her said, "First night is always the hardest. Everyone looks like they're pretending to relax." She turned and saw a tall man with kind eyes and a calm smile. He introduced himself as Michael Harper from Seattle. He said he was taking the cruise alone after a long year and just wanted quiet. There was nothing bold or inappropriate about him, just a softness that made conversation easy. Emma found herself laughing at his small joke about sea legs and nervous travelers. They spoke about simple things at first: how large the ship felt, how warm the evening air was, how strange it was to leave real life behind even for a week. Michael listened carefully when she spoke, not interrupting, not checking his phone. It felt surprisingly rare. She told him she was from Illinois, that her husband worked in finance, that her mother-in-law loved planning big events. She kept her tone light, but Michael seemed to notice the small pause before she mentioned Linda. He didn't ask too many questions, just nodded with understanding. The ship's horn echoed across the water, and lights shimmered on the dark waves. For the first time that day, Emma felt seen. It startled her. She had not realized how much she missed simple attention. When Daniel finally returned hours later, he apologized quickly and said the evening had been important for networking. Linda added that it was good for Daniel's career. Emma smiled and said she understood. She did understand. That was part of the problem. She always understood. Later that night, as she unpacked in their cabin, she replayed the short conversation with Michael in her mind. It had meant nothing, she told herself. Just a friendly chat with another passenger. Yet the ease of it stayed with her. The next morning at breakfast, Linda discussed the day's schedule in detail, choosing activities Daniel would enjoy. Emma nodded along, agreeing to everything. When she mentioned she might explore the art gallery on board, Linda suggested it would be better for her to join them at a wine tasting instead. Daniel said, "That sounds good," without noticing Emma's hesitation. She felt small but pushed the feeling aside. The cruise was supposed to bring them closer, not highlight distance. As they walked through the ship's grand hallway later that afternoon, Emma caught sight of Michael across the crowd. He offered a polite wave. She returned it before she could think. It was harmless. Still, her heart beat slightly faster. She didn't know why such a simple interaction felt important. Maybe because it was hers alone, separate from Daniel and Linda, separate from expectations. That evening, during a welcome show in the main theater, Daniel leaned forward to respond to another email while Linda whispered comments about the performers. Emma sat quietly between them, clapping at the right moments, smiling when expected. She felt like a guest in someone else's celebration. When the show ended, she stepped outside again for air. The ocean was dark and wide, the sky full of stars. She wondered when she had last felt truly close to her husband, when their conversations had shifted from dreams and jokes to schedules and responsibilities. She loved Daniel. She reminded herself of that firmly. Love was steady, even when it felt quiet. As she stood there thinking, she sensed someone approach but did not turn immediately. A familiar calm voice said, "The stars look brighter out here." It was Michael again, keeping a respectful distance. Emma smiled, surprised at how relieved she felt. They spoke only a few minutes before she excused herself to return to her cabin. Nothing unusual had happened. Nothing dramatic. Yet as she walked down the hallway toward her room, she felt the faint beginning of something she could not yet name, a shift, a crack, a whisper of change. She did not know that this cruise, meant to celebrate success and family, would slowly reveal everything fragile in her marriage. She only knew that for the first time in a long while, someone had looked at her as if she mattered, and that feeling, small and innocent as it seemed, would soon become the start of the biggest mistake of her life. By the second day of the cruise, Emma understood that the ocean was wide, but the space between her and Daniel felt even wider. The morning sun poured through the glass walls of the dining hall as Linda reviewed the day's plans with sharp excitement, listing private tastings, business dinners, and special events she had arranged for Daniel, and he listened with focus, nodding, checking his phone between bites of breakfast, already pulled back into work even while surrounded by blue water and music. Emma tried to join the conversation, suggesting a simple walk on the open deck or maybe watching the sailboats at the next port, but Linda gently redirected the plan each time, saying, "This cruise is about celebrating Daniel," and Daniel agreed without noticing how Emma's voice grew softer. By afternoon, Daniel was seated in a quiet lounge answering emails, Linda beside him offering advice about networking, and Emma found herself wandering alone through the ship's art gallery, pretending she preferred solitude. She stopped in front of a painting of a storm over the sea, staring at the dark clouds breaking into light, and she felt something similar inside her, restless, unsettled, waiting for calm. "That one feels heavy, doesn't it?" a familiar voice said beside her, and she turned to see Michael, holding a small travel notebook in his hand. He smiled politely, not too close, not too far. They began talking again, easy and natural, about art, about cities they loved, about how strange it was that strangers could meet in the middle of the ocean and share stories without pressure. He told her he had once lived in Boston before moving to Seattle, that he worked in architecture, that his marriage had ended not with shouting but with quiet distance that grew until there was nothing left to say. Emma listened carefully, feeling the weight of his words because they sounded too familiar. She didn't share everything about her own marriage, but she admitted that sometimes people can sit next to each other for years and still feel unseen. Michael didn't judge, didn't interrupt, just nodded as if he understood the space between words. Later that day, the ship docked in Nassau, and passengers poured onto the island streets, bright colors and music filling the air. Linda complained about the heat within minutes and suggested returning early to the ship, and Daniel agreed to go back with her, saying he needed stable internet for a quick call. Emma stood there holding her sun hat, watching them leave, feeling foolish for hoping he might choose to stay with her. She told herself she was fine, that she could explore alone, but as she turned toward the beach path, she saw Michael walking a few steps behind her. "If you're heading to the water, I was going that way too," he said casually, giving her room to decide. She hesitated only a second before nodding. The beach was bright and open, waves rolling gently against the sand, children laughing nearby, couples taking photos under palm trees. They walked side by side, shoes in hand, speaking about small things at first, favorite travel memories, the best coffee in their hometowns, childhood summers. The pace was light, but something deeper moved under the surface. Michael admitted he had taken this cruise to clear his mind, to prove to himself that he could enjoy life again without feeling like a failure. Emma told him she sometimes felt like she was trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect daughter-in-law, without knowing what she wanted for herself anymore. The wind lifted her hair as she spoke, and for once she did not feel judged or corrected. When their hands brushed briefly as they walked, the touch was accidental, but neither pulled away quickly. The contact lasted only a second, yet it felt like crossing a thin invisible line. Emma's heart beat faster, not because of passion, but because of awareness. She knew this feeling was dangerous, not dramatic, not wild, just quietly powerful. They sat on a wooden bench near the water, watching boats pass, and Michael said softly, "Sometimes we don't realize how lonely we are until someone listens." The sentence stayed with her. She wanted to deny it, but she couldn't. She had grown used to silence at home, to conversations about schedules, bills, family events, anything except feelings. Daniel wasn't cruel, he was busy, distracted, focused. Yet the warmth that once defined their relationship had faded into routine. Emma felt guilty even thinking this while sitting beside another man. She reminded herself that she loved her husband, that vows mattered, that this was just a conversation. Still, she didn't move away. When they returned to the ship that afternoon, the mood felt different. Linda greeted Emma with a polite smile that did not reach her eyes, asking lightly how the beach was, and Daniel barely looked up from his laptop when Emma entered the cabin to change for dinner. That night, during a crowded buffet, Linda talked proudly about Daniel's future while Emma nodded along, feeling like a background figure in someone else's story. Across the room, she caught sight of Michael sitting alone at a small table, reading. Their eyes met briefly. No smile, no wave this time, just recognition. Emma looked away first, her chest tight with confusion. She wasn't planning anything. She wasn't seeking trouble. But the connection had grown from simple politeness into something emotional, something that filled the empty spaces she had ignored for too long. Later, as she lay in bed beside Daniel, who had already fallen asleep, she stared at the ceiling and replayed the day in her mind, the sunlight on the water, the warmth of conversation, the way Michael had looked at her as if her thoughts mattered. She felt both comfort and guilt at the same time. Nothing inappropriate had happened, yet she sensed the shift clearly. Her heart had leaned towards someone else, even if only slightly. She turned onto her side, facing away from Daniel, listening to the steady hum of the ship moving through dark water. The ocean outside was calm, but inside her, waves were rising. She knew she should create distance the next day, avoid long talks, return her focus to her marriage. She promised herself she would. But as sleep slowly came, one thought remained stronger than the rest, the realization that loneliness does not disappear just because you are married, and attention, even gentle and innocent, can become the beginning of a mistake that feels small in the moment but grows quietly with every shared step along the shore. The third night of the cruise arrived with bright lights and formal music, and Emma felt a strange mix of excitement and fear as she stood in front of the mirror in their cabin, smoothing the deep blue dress Daniel once said made her eyes shine. She had chosen it carefully, hoping maybe tonight he would truly see her again. Daniel adjusted his tie while checking a message on his phone, glanced at her reflection, and said, "You look nice," before turning back to the screen, and that single word, nice, landed heavily in her chest because it sounded polite, not personal. In the grand dining hall, chandeliers sparkled above polished tables, and guests laughed over fine dinners while a soft band played near the stage. But at their table Linda guided every topic toward Daniel's career, praising his promotion, discussing future plans, and reminding him of contacts he should connect with before the cruise ended. Emma tried to join in, adding a light comment about how hard Daniel had worked, yet her voice faded as the conversation moved on without her, and she felt invisible sitting between them. Halfway through dessert, she excused herself quietly, saying she needed fresh air, and neither Daniel nor Linda objected, which somehow hurt more than if they had asked her to stay. The night air on the upper deck was cool and calm, the ocean dark and endless, the sky filled with bright stars that looked close enough to touch, and Emma gripped the railing, breathing slowly, telling herself she just needed a moment to reset her thoughts. Footsteps approached behind her, steady and familiar, and she didn't need to turn to know it was Michael. He stopped a respectful distance away and said softly, "It's beautiful out here," as if continuing a conversation that had been waiting all evening. She nodded, trying to keep her voice steady, but when she finally looked at him, she saw concern in his eyes, not curiosity, not excitement, just quiet understanding. They began to talk again, the words flowing quickly now, skipping small talk, moving straight into truth. Michael admitted that the hardest part of his divorce wasn't the paperwork but the feeling of becoming strangers with someone he once loved deeply, and Emma swallowed before confessing that she sometimes felt like she was fading in her own marriage, not because Daniel was cruel, but because life had become a list of responsibilities instead of shared dreams. The music from inside drifted faintly onto the deck, mixing with the sound of the waves, and Emma felt the world narrow to this simple conversation under the stars. She knew she should walk away, return to the safety of the bright dining hall, but her feet stayed still. Michael told her she deserved to feel valued, and those words, simple and kind, touched a part of her heart that had been quiet for too long. She didn't step closer, yet the space between them felt charged with emotion. When he reached out gently and took her hands, it wasn't dramatic or rushed, just steady, and Emma felt warmth spread through her chest, followed quickly by guilt. She knew this moment mattered more than she wanted it to. They stood there for a long time, saying little, just sharing silence that felt deeper than any conversation she'd had all week. When he pulled her into a brief embrace, it was soft and careful, not impulsive, and she closed her eyes for a second too long, letting herself feel comfort she had missed. In that quiet hug, Emma understood she had crossed a line, not through action, but through emotion. She had allowed someone else to step into a place meant for her husband. Michael whispered that meeting her had been unexpected and meaningful, and she felt tears threaten to rise because part of her agreed. She stepped back first, breathing unevenly, saying they needed to be careful, that this couldn't go further, and he nodded, promising he respected her marriage, but the promise felt fragile, like thin glass under pressure. When Emma finally returned to her cabin, her heart was racing. Daniel was already inside. Sitting on the edge of the bed, unusually quiet, and for a brief second she wondered if he could see the change in her face. He asked where she had been, and she answered honestly, on the deck, leaving out the rest. He studied her for a moment before nodding slowly, and the silence between them felt heavier than before. The next morning, something had shifted. Daniel was distant, his answers shorter, his eyes avoiding hers, and Linda barely spoke during breakfast, her polite smile tighter than usual. Emma's stomach tightened with fear because she sensed that the private world she had stepped into under the stars was no longer completely hidden. As she walked through the hallway later that day, she caught a glimpse of Michael near the elevators. Their eyes met briefly, filled with questions neither dared to ask. She realized that even without dramatic scenes, even without reckless choices, emotional closeness could shake the foundation of a marriage. The cruise still sparkled around them with laughter and sunshine, but inside Emma everything felt uncertain. She replayed the embrace in her mind, wondering how something so gentle could feel so heavy. She told herself she would end it, create distance, protect what she had built with Daniel, yet part of her feared it was already too late. Trust is delicate, and even if no one else knew the full truth, she knew it, and that knowledge followed her like a shadow. That night at dinner, Daniel barely touched her hand, and Linda's silence spoke louder than any accusation. Emma understood that the real turning point had not been the touch or the whisper, but the moment she allowed her heart to open in the wrong direction. Standing again by the railing before sleep, she looked at the dark water and realized that mistakes do not always arrive with noise. Sometimes they come quietly, dressed as comfort, shining under beautiful stars, and by the time you recognize them, the course of your life has already begun to change. The final evening of the cruise arrived with a heavy stillness that Emma could feel in her chest from the moment she opened her eyes, and although the ocean outside looked calm and bright under the morning sun, the space inside her cabin felt tense and quiet. Daniel dressed slowly, saying little, and Linda skipped breakfast, claiming she was tired, but Emma sensed that something had changed in a way that could not be undone. All day she avoided Michael, choosing crowded areas, sitting beside Daniel during activities even when he barely spoke, trying to act normal, yet the word normal felt distant now, like something left behind at the port in Miami. In the afternoon, as she returned to the cabin to pick up her sweater, she found Daniel standing by the window, staring at the water with a serious expression she had never seen before, and before she could speak, he said softly, "I saw you the other night, and her heart dropped so fast she had to grip the edge of the desk to steady herself. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't accuse, he simply explained that he had gone looking for her after dinner and had seen her on the deck with Michael, standing too close, holding hands, sharing a moment that looked intimate even from a distance. Emma tried to find the right words, but they felt tangled in her throat. She told him nothing physical had happened beyond that brief embrace, that it was a mistake born from loneliness, that she never planned to hurt him, and as she spoke, tears filled her eyes because she finally heard how weak those explanations sounded. Daniel listened without interrupting, his face pale, his eyes reflecting pain more than anger, and that quiet hurt cut deeper than any shouting could have. He asked her one question that echoed in her mind: "Were you unhappy with me?" The truth was complicated, but she answered honestly, saying she had felt distant, unseen, not unloved but forgotten, and Daniel closed his eyes for a moment as if absorbing a blow he hadn't expected. He admitted he had been distracted for months, focused on work, on proving himself, on meeting expectations, including his mother's, and he had assumed Emma understood because she always did. He said he never imagined she felt alone enough to turn towards someone else for comfort. Emma shook her head, explaining she hadn't meant to turn toward anyone, that it had started as conversation, as kindness, as simple listening, but she could see that intentions didn't erase impact. The cabin felt smaller with every word, the hum of the ship loud in the silence between them. Daniel sat down slowly and said trust was fragile, and even if she hadn't crossed every line, she had stepped close enough to break something important. Emma wanted to argue, to say it wasn't fair, but deep inside she knew he was right. Emotional closeness, shared secrets, and late-night embraces carried weight, even without dramatic actions. That evening, at the farewell dinner, the three of them sat together in strained politeness. Linda spoke carefully, her tone cool but controlled, and though she didn't mention what had happened, her eyes lingered on Emma with quiet disappointment that felt impossible to ignore. Across the room, Emma saw Michael once more. He didn't approach, didn't smile, only gave a small nod that carried both apology and goodbye. She felt a wave of sadness, not because she wanted to run to him, but because she realized how quickly something meaningful could grow and disappear at the same time. When the ship finally docked back in Miami the next morning, passengers lined up with luggage and travel bags, laughing about memories and sunburns, but Emma felt as if she were walking away from more than a vacation. She was walking into consequences. On the flight back to Chicago, Daniel stared out the window while Emma folded and unfolded her hands in her lap, both of them lost in separate thoughts. Once home in Naperville, the familiar walls felt different, as if the house itself knew something had shifted. The days that followed were filled with long talks at the kitchen table, some calm, some painful, but always honest. Daniel asked questions about how long she had felt lonely, and Emma answered without hiding, admitting she should have spoken up earlier instead of seeking comfort elsewhere. They agreed to attend counseling, not because their marriage was beyond repair, but because they both understood that ignoring cracks would only make them wider. Linda kept her distance for a while, and though she remained polite, the easy warmth between her and Emma was gone, replaced by careful respect. Emma blocked Michael's number and deleted his messages, not out of anger, but out of necessity. She knew that holding on to even a small connection would make rebuilding impossible. Weeks passed, and slowly, small changes began to appear. Daniel started leaving his phone on the table during dinner, asking Emma about her day with real attention, suggesting evening walks around their neighborhood like they used to take when they were first married. Emma, in return, learned to speak up about her feelings instead of burying them under patience and silence. Healing was not instant, trust did not fully return overnight, but effort replaced distance, and effort brought hope. Sometimes Emma still thought about the cruise, about the stars and the ocean breeze, about how easy it had felt to open her heart to someone who simply listened, and she would feel a quiet ache of regret, not for losing Michael, but for nearly losing her marriage. She realized that infidelity does not always begin with desire. Sometimes it begins with silence, with unmet needs, with conversations never spoken. The cruise had been meant to celebrate success, yet it revealed hidden weaknesses that could no longer be ignored. In the end, Emma understood that the biggest mistake of her life was not boarding the ship or meeting a kind stranger, It was waiting too long to admit she was hurting and allowing someone outside her marriage to step into a space that should have been protected. Standing months later in her backyard as autumn leaves fell gently around her, she watched Daniel laughing while grilling dinner, and she felt grateful for a second chance that many couples never receive. The memory of that cruise would always remain, a reminder of how close she had come to losing everything, but it also became a turning point, a lesson that love must be nurtured, that silence can be dangerous, and that even the quietest choices can shape the future in ways no one expects.